On the day of the Monaco Grand Prix, the first Soviet troops left Afghanistan, beginning a process of withdrawal that would last until February, though the bulk of the front-line forces would be gone by August. Of course, none of this could happen fast enough for the Afghans themselves, and the Mujahideen continued to attack the departing Soviets using the weapons that the US was continuing to supply them, while the Soviet Foreign Minister Edvard Shevardnadze and the KGB continued to push Gorbachev to keep up attacks on the Mujahideen forces to support the Kabul government, even while withdrawing. Over the border in northern Pakistan, a region disputed with India and also bordered by China, a local dispute arose between Shia and Sunni Muslims in the town of Gilgit and its surrounding areas, on the vital Karakoram highway. Since 1977, Pakistan had been ruled by a military junta under General Zia-ul-Haq, who pursued a policy of suppression of minority religions, including the Shia sect of Islam. A dispute over the date of the end of Ramadan and the celebration of Eid al-Fitr resulted in an attack by the Shias, who were still fasting, on the Sunnis, who had declared Eid and were celebrating. In response to the riots, Zia sent an army contingent to restore order, but they collected a group of local Sunni tribal militias from the local area, as well as a contingent led by one Osama bin Laden from across the border in Afghanistan. These tribal forces, allegedly told to teach the Shias a lesson, attacked Gilgit and massacred hundreds of people. Exact casualty figures are heavily disputed, ranging between 150 and 700, with villages burned down and hundreds of reported but unverified rapes, and all the usual looting and pillaging that goes along with this kind of thing. In the UK, the Local Government Act became law. It made various changes to the way local government operated, abolishing the need for people to have a licence to own a dog, for example, but was most controversial for Section 28 of the Act, which prohibited local authorities from promoting the teaching of the acceptability of homosexuality as a pretended family relationship. The clause was hotly debated beforehand, both in terms of its general morality, but also in how it would be applied, and exactly what counted as promoting rather than simply describing or discussing. Clause 28 was finally repealed by the Scottish Parliament in 2000 and the Westminster Parliament for England and Wales in 2003. In more positive news, the Albert Dock in Liverpool was officially reopened. The original dock buildings, built in the 1840s in brick, stone and iron, making them the first largely fireproof warehouses in the world, had fallen out of use with the rise of container transport in the 1960s and had closed in 1972, exacerbating the decline of Liverpool's local economy. Redevelopment had started in 1981, and parts of the new complex had been opening in bits over the years. By 1988, the vast majority of the buildings were open, with the expensive flats in the old warehouses being snapped up like sales day at Harrods, according to one book on the subject. The docks and the northern branch of the Tate Gallery were opened by Prince Charles, the great-great-great-grandson of Prince Albert, for whom they were originally named and who'd originally opened them. And breakfast television show This Morning began broadcasting from one of the dockside buildings, famously using a floating map of the UK for their weather forecasts. And Fleetwood Mac were beginning a European tour to promote their 1987 album Tango in the Night, which gave the BBC's coverage show an opportunity to do a live version of their theme tune.
One of the programme's most popular features has been its theme music, the evocative strains of The Chain, written and played by these world-famous people, Fleetwood Mac. Now, this is the first time in 10 years that Fleetwood Mac have been back to the UK, so it's my pleasure to thank them on behalf of Grand Prix fans everywhere for all the enjoyment they've given us and for some wonderful music.
The F1 teams arrived in Mexico with mixed feelings. If Monaco had been expected to level the playing field but ended up with the McLarens as dominant as ever, what hope did anyone have on the high-speed, high-altitude Mexico City circuit? The atmospheric cars were predicted to lose up to a quarter of their power in the thinner air, and the long straight would give the turbos even more of an advantage. And although most of the damage from the 1985 earthquake had now been repaired, the poverty in evidence in the city was still uncomfortably at odds with the glamour and conspicuous commercialism of Formula One. Most teams hadn't made any major changes to their cars since Monaco. Ligier had tested their 1987 car with the Ford engine in the back, only to find it even slower than their troublesome current model, while Ferrari had made some engine modifications to try and close the power gap to the Hondas. But rumours were seeping out that all was not well at Maranello, despite the team's improvement in form over the last few races of 1987 and the start of 88. Internal politics are never far from the surface at Ferrari, especially when they're not winning regularly, and Berger and Alboreto would just be hoping that it didn't impact the on-track performance. The Real, Scuderia Italia, Eurobrunn and Coloni guys all turned out early for pre-qualifying, only for Modena to be excluded again, this time for a fractionally too wide rear wing, so the rest went through to Friday's afternoon session when Mansell had his suspension collapse at high speed, while Philippe Alliot had another nasty crash on Saturday when his back end snapped out after Peraltada. Alliot was stretchered away as a precaution, but turned out to be unhurt. Unfortunately, he was already in the spare car, as his chassis from Monaco hadn't been rebuilt yet, so the Larousse boys would have a long job to put it back together to give him something to race the next day. But of course, nobody could touch the McLarens, and in the end it was Senna once more who took the pole, setting a time nearly a second faster than Mansell's 1987 pole time, set with about 300 more horsepower, 224 kilowatts of power at his disposal. Prost was second, also beating Mansell's time, with Berger lining up in his now customary third place, but much closer to the McLarens. In fourth was Piquet, much happier on this track, with Alboreto fifth and Nakajima redeeming himself for Monaco with a best ever sixth slot. Chiva was seventh, Nannini the best atmospheric car in eighth, then Warwick and Capelli 10th. Alliot's time was good enough for 13th, if he had a car to drive, while Mansell did manage to get back in and go faster after his shunt on Friday, but could still only manage 14th, with Patrese back in 17th. The turbo advantage even helped the Zach speeds and meant that Bernd Schneider would get to make his Grand Prix debut at last from a very respectable 15th, a 10th ahead of his teammate Ginzani, with Larrauri squeaking his Eurobrunn onto the back of the grid. The non-qualifiers were Larini, Campos again, and for the first time since 1985, both Tyrrells. The Larousse mechanics did a fantastic job overnight, and Alliot took his place on the grid as they all lined up for the start, with clouds looming and rain forecast, only for Nannini to stall his engine. The yellow flags came out and the start was scrubbed. 15 minutes later they did another parade lap, which was knocked off the total for the race, and then had another go. Alliot's car still wasn't right, and he took a while getting underway for the parade lap, so he would start from the back. The second start was successful, though Sala stalled his Minardi and had to get a push start, and Piquet got a flyer to take second from Senna going into turn 1, with Nakajima likewise going up to fourth as Berger dropped behind them both. He led his teammate Alboreto, then Nannini, who lost out to Warwick in the infield section. Prost was already leaving Piquet behind as they came round to finish lap 1, as Senna moved inside the Lotus at the Peraltada and powered past. Meanwhile, Chiva had also got past Nannini, so they finished lap 1 in the Noah's Ark formation, 2x2, McLaren, McLaren, Lotus, Lotus, Ferrari, Ferrari, Arrows, Arrows, Benetton, Benetton. Meanwhile, Alliot's rear wishbone had cracked and he came in to retire, a scant reward for all the team's efforts, but they could be proud of getting the car on the grid at all. Senna quickly pulled out from Piquet, and fans and pundits were looking forward to the on-track battle between the two McLarens that had not materialised so far this year. Berger got past Nakajima off-screen on lap 3 and was charging in pursuit of Piquet, but Senna didn't seem to be making much of an impression on Prost. There was a long way to go, of course, and all the drivers were aware that this surface was particularly hard on tyres. Behind the McLarens, Berger had caught up to Piquet, and Alboreto had got ahead of Nakajima. Piquet's car may not have been as good as the Ferrari overall, but it could do straight-line speed, and Piquet was too seasoned a campaigner to allow Berger an opportunity to pass on a corner, so the Austrian was forced to bide his time as Alboreto closed in on the battle. Finally, on lap 9, Berger got all his ducks in a row going into turn 1 and was through, to a cheer from the Mexican crowd who had fond memories of the Rodriguez brothers, both of whom had driven for Ferrari in various categories. In fact, Ricardo Rodriguez remains the youngest man ever to drive for Ferrari in Formula 1. Berger was 12 seconds behind Senna, while Prost was still pulling away from his teammate. Gugelmin posted his third retirement in 4 races with an electrical problem just past the pits on lap 11. The Williams cars, meanwhile, were having an absolute mare of a race, as Piercarlo Ghinzani in 9th led Patrese, Tarquini, Johansson, Arnoux, Caffey and Mansell in 15th, and Prost was approaching to lap the lot of them as early as lap 13. In an incident the cameras only caught the aftermath of, Caffey lost his brakes and rammed Arnoux. The Italian was out straight away, while the Frenchman, minus rear wing, limped round to retire in the pits. But by now the front of the race had stabilised, with Prost leading Senna, Berger, Piquet, Alboreto and Nakajima. Notably, Alboreto hadn't even been able to catch Piquet, let alone pass him, and was still some 3 seconds behind the Lotus. Schneider's Grand Prix debut lasted just 17 laps, until the traditional Zack-speed engine failure, the same lap as Patrese's Judd gave up. In 7th and 8th, Cheever and Warwick were having a lively private battle in their Arrows Megatrons, as they too came round to lap Mansell and Sala, and the pair were also slowly catching Nakajima's Lotus. Mansell's race didn't last much longer, pulling in to retire and cap off Williams' worst weekend in a very long time. Warwick got himself ahead of Cheever on lap 26 and began to pull away a bit as Berger continued to charge in pursuit of the McLarens, setting successive fastest laps to bring the gap down to 3 seconds behind Senna, and Alboreto began at last to edge closer to Piquet. Nakajima's solid drive came to an end in a cloud of Honda smoke on lap 28, which put Warwick into the points. At around half distance, Berger's fuel warning light came on and he was forced to back off a bit to ensure he'd be able to finish, which took the pressure off the McLarens. Alboreto had meanwhile eased a bit closer again to Piquet, the pair of them the last remaining cars on the lead lap by this point. The race had become something of a procession. As the leaders entered lap 50 of the 67, there hadn't actually been a change in the top 10 positions since Nakajima's engine went on lap 28. Though there were individual battles going on, including the one between Warwick and Cheever, interrupted briefly by Berger lapping them both, as Jackie Oliver tore his hair out on the pit wall as the pair came pretty close to banging wheels at speed. Every time Senna sped up, Prost sped up with him, setting a series of fastest laps in the last 10 laps of the race, while Alboreto was suddenly catching Piquet quite rapidly. The reason became obvious a couple of laps later as the Lotus pulled to the side with a haze of oil smoke emitting from the rear as Alboreto swept through with Prost approaching to lap him. So it was back to Noah's Ark. McLaren, Ferrari, Arrows, Benetton as the race entered its last few laps, and that was where they finished after 67 laps, at least for the top 3, the only 3 to go the full distance. Prost took another lights-to-flag win to extend his championship lead and continue his dominance in the McLaren team, having won 3 races to Senna's 1. Berger would join them on the podium after a game stab, but ultimately nearly a minute behind Senna, with Alboreto, Warwick and Cheever taking the rest of the points, a 100% turbo whitewash for the points places, with the Benettons top of the Atmos in 7th and 8th. Nannini, it emerged, had been racing with a pinched nerve in his foot for most of the race. Further back, Tarquini and Larrauri posted their first career Grand Prix finishes. Berger was left wondering what might have been, as it emerged that he'd been fined for fuel and the warning light had come on in error, but realistically it looked like nobody could beat McLaren just yet. In fact, such was the McLaren speed that Prost's fastest lap had beaten Piquet's previous lap record, with a 4-bar boost Williams, by half a second.